Hello, my name is Tom Schaefer. I'm pastor of Faith United Lutheran Church in Toledo, Ohio. And this is Faith United Online. Thanks for joining us. Our reading today is from the Gospel of St. John, the 2nd chapter. On the 3rd day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine, and did not know where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk, but you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. I've been a pastor for over 30 years now, and you can imagine in that time I've done a lot of different weddings. One of my favorites was a Lord of the Rings themed wedding that I took part in, that I officiated over. I did a 50s theme wedding. I did a destination wedding in Cancun. That was a lot of fun. I did a wedding where the bride, who twice before canceled her weddings to other men, I know it sounds like a movie you may have heard of, was over an hour late for the ceremony. Everyone was pretty nervous. The wedding went off though. But let's face it, the most fun part of a wedding is the reception. For my oldest daughter's wedding reception, I turned water into beer. And it took 4 weeks in a brewery that I owned to do it, but I still did it. Today, in the Gospel of John, we read about Jesus' first miracle, turning water into wine. Now, in Jesus' day, the reception of a wedding went on typically for 7 days, and it was 7 days of food and music and dancing. It was a huge party, and it definitely involved a lot of wine. And running out of wine would be quite an embarrassment. Now, we don't know whose wedding this was, but in the least, Jesus and his mother were friends of the family. They were invited to the wedding. Whatever the case, the groom running out of wine was a concern for Mary, and so she goes to Jesus and says, "They have no wine." Now, Jesus' response is not disrespectful, but it is authoritative. What Jesus is saying is that his time, when he acts, when he does a miracle, is not dictated or controlled by human circumstances. It is controlled by God, his Father. Now, his mom, however, doesn't even seem to listen to that. She simply says to those around her, "Do whatever he tells you to do." And that's good news for us. It's good news because even though it may be true that when God acts in our lives can't be controlled by us, Jesus' actions show us that God can decide or be swayed by our persistence. Jesus, in fact, once told a story like this. It occurs in the Gospel of St. Luke, the 18th chapter, and it's called the parable of the widow and the unjust judge. Listen to this parable. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, 'Grant me justice against my opponent.' For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, 'Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?'" Now, one could almost imagine that that story was about his mother. We can't make God do anything, is what the story tells us. But God can decide to listen, and he can decide to act. And Jesus does just that. Now, these jars that they find, these 6 jars, we think of jars as perhaps small containers, but as you hear, they each contain 20 to 30 gallons. And so really this is the equivalent of 55-gallon barrels of wine. Now, in case that number doesn't really register in your head, that is roughly 1,000 bottles of wine. Yep, 1,000 bottles of wine. That is a lot of wine. And that's ultimately the point here. When God does choose to bless, he often does it in unexpected, lavish, and extravagant ways. He completely fills the jars to the brim, is what the text tells us. No more blessing could fit inside these jars than what Jesus put in there. Now you still might be thinking, what an odd miracle though. What a strange miracle for Jesus to do as his first miracle. Well, there's a few things we need to understand. One, wedding receptions were hugely significant. They were called feasts or banquets. And in the Old Testament, we find this other theme of what's called the Messianic banquet. Take a listen, for instance, to Isaiah chapter 25, verse 6. On this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all his peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wines strained clear. It's an image of this banquet, the Messianic banquet, that comes when God chooses to bestow his blessings on the earth, chooses to empty his grace out upon the earth. Jesus and subsequently writers of the New Testament used the image of this banquet and of a wedding banquet to speak about the coming of God's grace and God's love and God's blessing into the world. Listen, for instance, to Matthew 22. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son." In Mark chapter 2, Jesus says, "The wedding guests cannot fast while the bridegroom is with them." Can they? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. And then again in Revelations chapter 19, we read this, "Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready." Now, I doubt that when Jesus does this miracle, that they fully realized the significance of what Jesus was doing, besides turning water into wine, unless Jesus explained it to them. But in time, they came to understand this miracle as symbolic of something much bigger. Of the great messianic banquet, of the wedding banquet that Jesus spoke of. It came to symbolize for them salvation, how the grace of God is given to the full, how nothing is done to deserve it, but God gives it. And that's really good news for you and me. God is so extravagantly generous with his grace. In the banquet of your life, maybe you have been trying to get by on the cheap stuff, the Boone's Farm. Maybe your life has run dry. And then God gives you a Screaming Eagle Cabernet. And in case you don't know, a bottle of that will put you back about $4,000. So it's not just even then, it's not just a bottle of the stuff that God gives you. He gives you barrels of the stuff. God's generosity. All you need to do is invite him to the party, and God will pour out on you lavishly grace and love and peace. Now, every time in the church, when we gather for worship, we celebrate communion. And every time you come to the communion table, we're supposed to remember this generosity of God. That's why the church calls communion a foretaste of the feast to come. Communion is a small taste of the of the lavish grace that we are going to experience in the great wedding feast, the Messianic banquet. It's a taste of the blessing that God has prepared for you. He fills you to the brim with His grace. And that's the message here. God's grace is like an open bar at a reception. It just keeps pouring. That's the promise. That we get to eat and drink and dance at the reception that will be thrown for each of us one day in heaven. Thanks for joining us this week. I really appreciate those of you that continue to listen in, and would love for you to share this with somebody else. Would love to see some of those subscriber numbers kicking up, gaining a few more there, and please do hit the notification bell for so that you'll be notified whenever a new video comes up from Faith United Online. Until next week, God bless. Keep safe.